At the family dinner, my daughter-in-law leaned close enough for me to feel her breath and whispered, "I'm pregnant with you." And then she smiled like she had just won something I didn't even know we were playing for. I didn't react. I didn't pull away. I simply nodded and reached for my glass of iced tea as if she had commented on the weather, but inside, something cold and precise settled into place. The dining room looked exactly as it always did on Sundays. Polished oak table, white plates with gold trim, the faint smell of rosemary chicken still lingering in the air, but suddenly it all felt staged, like I had been invited into a scene that had been rehearsed without me. Daniel sat across from me, cutting his food into careful, even pieces, not looking up once, not noticing, or maybe choosing not to. I had raised that boy to meet people's eyes when he spoke, to stand straight, to say what he meant, and now he couldn't even look at his own mother. Sophia returned to her seat as if nothing had happened, her hand brushing Daniel's shoulder in a way that felt deliberate, almost performative, and I watched the two of them the way you watch something fragile teeter on the edge of breaking, except I already knew it had. The chandelier above us cast a warm light across the table, catching the small details I had once taken pride in, the folded linen napkins, the serving dishes I had owned for over 30 years, the same ones I used when my husband was still alive, when dinners like this meant something different. Back then, there had been laughter that came easily, conversations that didn't feel measured, silences that were comfortable instead of loaded. Now, every pause felt intentional, every glance carried weight, and every word seemed to be placed carefully, like pieces on a board I hadn't agreed to play on. I took a bite of my food, chewing slowly, giving myself time, not because I needed to think, but because I needed to observe. Sophia was too calm, too composed, her smile appearing at the right moments, her voice light when she spoke, but there was a sharpness underneath it now, something calculated that hadn't always been there, or maybe it had, and I had simply chosen not to see it. For years, I had told myself she was just different, that her way of doing things, her way of speaking, her way of slowly shifting traditions until they no longer resembled what we once had, was just part of change. But sitting there, with her words still echoing quietly in my ears, I realized this wasn't sudden. This had been building, layer by layer, moment by moment, in conversations I had dismissed, in small decisions that had slowly moved me further and further to the edge of my own family. Daniel finally spoke, asking if I wanted more potatoes, his voice neutral, almost rehearsed, and I looked at him for a second longer than necessary, searching for something familiar, something that told me I still knew who he was. But all I saw was distance. I smiled politely and declined, setting my fork down with steady hands. Across from me, Sophia watched me, not openly, but enough, her eyes flicking in my direction, measuring, waiting. She thought she had just handed me something that would shake me, something that would make me react, make me lose composure, make me smaller in a room that used to be mine. Instead, I let the silence stretch just a little longer than comfortable. I had learned something important in that moment, something I should have understood much earlier. Not everything needs to be answered right away. Some things reveal themselves more clearly when you let them sit, when you allow people to believe their version of the story is the only one that matters. I picked up my napkin, dabbed it lightly at the corner of my mouth, and for the first time that evening, I looked directly at Sophia and held her gaze, not with anger, not with confusion, but with something quieter, something steadier. Because whatever she thought she had just started, I already knew one thing for certain. She had underestimated me. I stayed at the table longer than usual that night, long after the plates had been cleared and the faint clinking of dishes from the kitchen had faded into silence, because leaving too quickly would have meant admitting something had changed, and I was not ready to give them that. Daniel excused himself first, mumbling something about an early meeting the next morning, his chair scraping lightly against the hardwood floor, a sound that felt louder than it should have, and he still did not look at me as he walked out of the room. That, more than anything, settled a quiet certainty inside me. Sophia lingered, wiping an already clean counter with slow, deliberate movements, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened window above the sink, watching me without turning her head. I could feel it without needing to see it directly, the way she was waiting, measuring, expecting something from me that I had no intention of giving. I folded my napkin carefully, smoothing it flat against the table before placing it beside my plate, a small, controlled gesture that grounded me in the moment. For years, I had been the one who stayed late to clean, to reset the space, to make sure everything was ready for the next day, but tonight, I let my hands rest in my lap instead. The house felt different, not unfamiliar, but shifted in a way that made every object seem slightly out of place, as if the meaning attached to them had been quietly rearranged while I was not looking. When my husband was alive, this room had been the center of everything, a place where decisions were made together, where voices overlapped, where silence never carried suspicion. After he passed, I told myself I could keep that feeling alive if I just held everything together tightly enough, if I kept the routines the same, if I made sure nothing slipped. But sitting there now, I realized something had been slipping for a long time. It had not been loud or obvious. It had been subtle, almost polite. A change in tone here, a delayed invitation there, a decision made without asking me, explained afterward as if it had always been that way. I had accepted each small shift because it was easier than questioning it, easier than risking conflict, easier than admitting that I was slowly being moved to the edge of my own life. Sophia finally turned toward me, drying her hands with a towel, her expression composed, her voice light when she spoke, asking if I needed anything else before she headed upstairs. It was such a simple question, one I had heard 100 times before, but now it carried a different weight, like an echo of something unspoken. I looked at her for a moment, noticing how perfectly everything about her seemed arranged, from the way her hair fell into place to the steady calm in her posture, and I understood then that whatever she had said earlier had not been impulsive. It had been intentional, measured, designed to land exactly where it did. I shook my head gently and told her I was fine, my voice even, my expression unchanged, and for a brief second, something flickered across her face, not surprise exactly, but something close to it, as if she had expected a different response and was adjusting to the one she received. When she left the room, the quiet that followed was not empty. It was clear. I sat there for a few minutes longer, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of footsteps above me, and I allowed myself to think, not in fragments or questions, but in a steady line that led somewhere specific. I did not need to rush. Whatever game had been set in motion, it was not one that would be resolved in a single conversation. It would unfold slowly, in details, in patterns, in things said and unsaid. And this time, I would not miss them. I stood up, turning off the lights one by one as I moved through the house, each switch marking a small, deliberate choice, and by the time I reached the staircase, I no longer felt uncertain. I felt prepared, because for the first time in a long while, I was not reacting. I was paying attention. The next morning, the house carried a quiet that felt heavier than usual, the kind that lingers even after the sun has fully come up, and I woke earlier than I normally would, not because I could not sleep, but because my mind had already settled into a rhythm of observation that refused to slow down. I moved through the kitchen with familiar motions, filling the kettle, setting out a single cup, noticing how everything looked the same and yet felt slightly altered, as if I were seeing it from a different angle for the first time. Daniel came downstairs about 20 minutes later, dressed for work, his tie slightly off-center, his expression distracted in a way that might have gone unnoticed before, but now every detail stood out. He greeted me with a brief smile, polite, almost automatic, and poured himself coffee without asking if I wanted anything, which in itself was not unusual, but the absence of small courtesies begins to mean something when it repeats often enough. I watched him as he checked his phone, his thumb scrolling quickly, his attention elsewhere, and I realized that whatever had been said the night before had not been an isolated moment. It had been part of something ongoing, something that had already taken root long before I was aware of it. Sophia did not come down right away, which was unlike her, as she usually made a point of being present during these small morning routines, maintaining the image of cohesion, of normalcy, of control. When she finally appeared, she moved with the same calm precision I had noticed before, greeting Daniel softly, placing a hand on his arm for just a second longer than necessary, and then turning to me with a gentle smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She asked how I had slept, her tone light, her posture relaxed, as if the previous evening had never happened, and I answered simply that I had slept well, because the truth was not something she needed to hear yet. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, and in that space, I saw it again, that flicker of calculation, of expectation, like she was waiting for me to fill the silence with questions or confusion. But I did not. I took a slow sip of my tea instead, letting the moment pass without offering her anything to hold on to. Daniel glanced between us once, just once, and then looked away, which told me more than anything he could have said. He knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to avoid, enough to stay quiet, enough to let things unfold without stepping in. After he left for work, the front door closing with a soft, final click, the house seemed to settle again. But this time the quiet felt different, more focused, like the beginning of something rather than the end of it. Sophia began clearing the counter, her movements efficient, controlled, and I remained at the table, watching not her, but the patterns around her, the way she chose what to touch first, what to leave for later, how she positioned herself in the room. It was not random. None of it was. For years, I had believed that control in a household came from the person who held everything together, who remembered the details, who made sure everyone was taken care of. But now I was beginning to understand that control can also come from something quieter, something less visible, from shaping perceptions, from guiding conversations without appearing to, from creating a version of reality that others accept without question. And Sophia was very good at that. Too good for it to be accidental. I stood up slowly, carrying my cup to the sink, placing it down with care, and when I turned back toward her, I allowed myself to meet her gaze directly for the first time that morning. She did not look away. That was important. People who are unsure look away. People who believe they are in control hold your gaze. I gave her a small, polite smile, the kind that reveals nothing, and told her I had a few errands to run, my voice steady, my tone unchanged. She nodded, stepping slightly to the side to let me pass, and as I walked by her, I could feel it again, that sense that she was measuring something, adjusting, recalculating. That was fine. Let her. Because for the first time, I was doing the same. I did not go where I had originally planned that morning, because somewhere between stepping out the front door and sitting behind the wheel of my car, I realized that routine would only keep me in the same place, and I was no longer interested in staying where I was expected to be. Instead, I drove slowly through the neighborhood, past the familiar houses, the trimmed hedges, the quiet sidewalks that had not changed in years, and I let my thoughts move backward, not in a scattered way, but in a deliberate line, revisiting moments I had once dismissed as unimportant. It is a strange thing, how memory works when you begin to look at it differently. Details that once felt ordinary start to carry weight, and small inconsistencies begin to form. Patterns that are impossible to ignore. I thought about the early days after Sophia joined our family, how effortlessly she had blended in at first, always attentive, always agreeable, learning our habits, our traditions, the way things were done in this house. At the time, I had appreciated it. I had even admired it. It felt like respect. But now, as I replayed those same moments, I saw something else beneath the surface, something quieter and more strategic. She had not just been learning. She had been mapping, understanding where she fit, where she could influence, where she could eventually shift things without drawing attention to it. I parked the car near a small park a few miles from the house, one I used to visit with my husband on Sunday afternoons, and I sat there for a while without getting out, watching as a few people walked their dogs, their routines simple, unguarded, untouched by the kind of awareness that now occupied my mind. There had been a time when I lived like that too, when I believed that what I saw was exactly what was there, that intentions were as straightforward as they appeared. But life has a way of teaching you otherwise, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. I remembered a conversation from nearly a year ago, one that had seemed insignificant at the time. Sophia had asked a series of questions about the house, about how it had been purchased, about whose name was on what, about what plans I had made for the future. She had framed it casually, almost thoughtfully, as if she were simply trying to understand, and I had answered without hesitation, without suspicion. Now, sitting there with the engine off and the quiet pressing in around me, I could hear those questions again, not as curiosity, but as preparation. It was never about the answers themselves. It was about what those answers allowed her to do next. I stepped out of the car finally, the air cool against my skin, and walked a short distance along the path, my steps measured, my pace steady. I was not overwhelmed. I was not confused. If anything, I felt clearer than I had in a long time. Because once you see the pattern, once the pieces begin to align, the uncertainty fades. What remains is understanding, and with that comes a different kind of strength. I sat down on a bench for a few minutes, watching the light shift through the trees, and I let myself consider the present, not just the past. Whatever Sophia had said the night before, whatever she believed she had introduced into the equation, it was not random. It was part of something larger, something she expected to control. But control only works when the other person does not realize they are part of it. I stood up again, brushing my hands lightly against my coat, and turned back toward the car, my decision already made without needing to say it out loud. I would not confront her. Not yet. There was no value in reacting too soon, in giving away what I had begun to understand. Some truths reveal themselves more completely when you allow them space, when you give people enough time to show you exactly who they are and what they intend to do. And this time, I intended to see everything. By the time I returned home, the house looked exactly the same as when I had left it, but I no longer trusted appearances the way I used to, and that alone changed how I moved through each room, how I noticed things I might have once overlooked. The front hallway was quiet, sunlight stretching across the floor in long, clean lines, and I paused for just a second before closing the door behind me, listening, not for sound, but for presence. Sophia was home. I could sense it in the subtle details, a purse placed neatly on the side table that had not been there earlier, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, light but deliberate. I set my keys down without making noise and walked further in, my steps measured, my attention sharpened not by fear, but by clarity. She was in the living room, seated with her laptop open, her posture relaxed, as if the entire house existed around her rather than the other way around. When she looked up and saw me, her expression shifted smoothly into something welcoming, controlled, almost practiced, and she asked if everything had gone well with my errands, her voice warm in a way that felt just a degree too perfect. I told her everything was fine, and placed my coat over the back of the chair, watching how her eyes followed the movement for just a moment longer than necessary before returning to her screen. There was a pause between us, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, like both of us understood that something unspoken now existed in the space we shared. She closed her laptop slowly, giving me her full attention, and for the first time since the previous evening, she stepped closer, reducing the distance in a way that might have seemed natural to anyone else, but now felt intentional. She asked if I had thought about what she said, her tone still light, but there was something underneath it now, something sharper, as if she expected that question alone would be enough to shift the balance. I met her gaze calmly, allowing just enough silence to settle before answering, and told her that some things are better understood over time rather than immediately. It was a simple response, but it changed something. I saw it in the way her expression tightened for a fraction of a second before smoothing out again, the way she adjusted her stance, recalibrating. She had expected uncertainty. She had expected reaction. What she was getting instead was distance, and that unsettled her more than anything else could have. She nodded slowly, as if accepting my answer, but I could tell she was already thinking ahead, already adjusting whatever plan she believed was in motion. That was fine. Let her think she was ahead. Let her believe she was guiding the direction of things. Because while she had been preparing her moves for months, maybe longer, I had something she did not account for. Time. I had no need to rush. No need to force a confrontation before I understood everything fully. I moved past her into the kitchen, filling a glass of water, taking my time, aware of her presence behind me, aware that she was still watching, still measuring. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, less like tension and more like space being created, space that would eventually reveal what had been hidden. I turned slightly, leaning against the counter, and allowed myself to study her openly now, not as a mother, observing her son's wife, but as someone seeing clearly for the first time. She held her ground, meeting my gaze without hesitation, and in that moment, there was no pretense left, no need for polite gestures or careful words. Just two people standing in the same room, both aware that something had shifted, something that could not be undone. I gave her a small, composed smile, not warm, not cold, simply controlled, and turned away again, ending the moment on my terms. Because whatever she believed she had started, I was no longer part of it in the way she expected. I was outside of it now, watching, waiting, and understanding more with every passing minute. That evening unfolded with a quiet precision that felt almost rehearsed, not because anything dramatic happened, but because everything stayed just slightly too controlled, as if we were all playing our parts more carefully than usual, aware that something beneath the surface had shifted and could no longer be ignored. Daniel returned home around 6, his usual time, setting his keys down in the same spot by the door, greeting us both with a neutral tone that did not quite match the ease he used to carry into the room. And I watched him the way I had begun watching everything else, not for what was obvious, but for what was missing. He asked about my day, about simple things, keeping the conversation safely on the surface, and I answered in the same way, matching his rhythm, not offering more than necessary, not giving him anything to push against. Sophia moved through the kitchen with her usual efficiency, preparing dinner with movements that were smooth, familiar, but now clearly intentional, each action placed in a sequence that kept her in control of the space without appearing to claim it. At one point, she reached for a drawer and paused for just a fraction of a second when she noticed I was watching, then continued as if nothing had interrupted her. But that moment was enough. Small pauses like that do not exist without reason. They are the result of awareness, of knowing you are being observed and adjusting accordingly. We sat down to eat not long after, the three of us positioned exactly as we had been the night before, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that did not need to be spoken aloud. Conversation stayed light, careful, almost curated, and I let it remain that way, contributing just enough to maintain balance while keeping my attention on the spaces between the words. It is often in those spaces that truth begins to reveal itself. At one point, Daniel mentioned something about a future plan, a vague reference to changes that might be coming in the next few months. And though his words were casual, his tone carried something else, something hesitant, as if he was testing how much could be said without fully saying it. Sophia responded quickly, smoothly redirecting the conversation before it could settle, her voice light, her smile easy, and if I had not been paying attention, I might have missed it entirely. But I did not miss it. I noticed the way Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly after she spoke, the way he allowed her to take control of the moment without resistance. That told me more than any direct answer could have. After dinner, as the dishes were being cleared, I offered to help, knowing the answer before I even asked. Sophia declined politely, as she always did, insisting she had it handled, her tone kind, but firm in a way that left no room for negotiation. It had always seemed like a gesture of care before, a way of taking responsibility, but now it felt different. Now it felt like a boundary. A quiet way of keeping me out of certain parts of the routine, of maintaining control over what I could see and what I could not. I stepped back without argument, drying my hands on a towel that I no longer needed, and moved into the living room, where I sat down and let the sounds from the kitchen carry in softly, the clinking of plates, the running water, the low murmur of voices that did not quite reach me. They were speaking, but not loudly enough for me to hear what was being said, and that alone was enough to confirm what I had already begun to understand. Some conversations are not meant to be overheard. Some plans are not meant to be shared. But silence, if you listen carefully enough, still tells its own story. I leaned back, slightly, folding my hands in my lap, and let the evening continue without interruption, because there was no need to rush what was already unfolding. Whatever they believed they were managing, whatever direction they thought things were moving in, I had already stepped outside of it. And from there, everything becomes clearer. The following morning did not bring clarity in the way people often expect it to. No sudden realization, no dramatic shift, but something quieter, something more precise, a series of small confirmations that aligned too perfectly to be ignored. I woke before the alarm again, not out of restlessness, but because my mind had already adjusted to a different way of seeing things, one that did not allow for careless assumptions anymore. The house was still, the kind of stillness that exists just before the day begins, and I moved through it slowly, deliberately, letting each detail settle into place as I noticed it. When I reached the kitchen, I found something subtle but telling, a folder placed neatly at the edge of the counter, something that had not been there the night before. It was not hidden, not tucked away, but positioned just within view. as if meant to be overlooked by someone who was not paying attention. I did not touch it right away. Instead, I set my cup down, filled it with tea, and sat at the table, allowing myself a few moments to simply observe, to let the presence of it exist without immediately reacting. That was something I had learned over the past few days. Not everything needs to be addressed the moment it appears. Sometimes it reveals more if you let it sit. When I finally stood and walked over to the counter, I opened the folder carefully, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what I might find. Inside were documents, neatly organized, printed clearly, bearing my name, Daniel's name, and references to the house, to ownership, to transfers that had not yet happened but were clearly being prepared. The language was formal, structured, but the intention behind it was unmistakable. This was not a conversation waiting to happen. This was a plan already in motion. I closed the folder slowly, placing it back. Exactly where it had been, my movements calm, measured, because the discovery itself did not shock me anymore. It confirmed what I had already begun to understand. Sophia entered the kitchen just as I returned to my seat, her timing precise, her expression composed, but there was a brief flicker in her eyes when she noticed the position of the folder, a small shift that might have gone unnoticed before, but now stood out clearly. She asked if I had seen it, her tone light, almost casual, as if the question carried no weight, but I could hear the expectation behind it. I looked at her for a moment, allowing just enough silence to pass before answering, and told her that I had, and that it was very organized. It was a simple response, neutral, but it carried more than it appeared to. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, not in relief, but in adjustment, as if she had just recalculated something internally. She began explaining, offering a version of events that framed everything as preparation, as care, as something being done for the benefit of the family, and I listened without interruption, not because I believed her explanation, but because I wanted to hear how she chose to present it. The words people use when they think they are in control often reveal more than the facts themselves. When she finished, there was another pause, one that lingered just a little longer than comfortable, and I nodded once, acknowledging what she had said without confirming or denying anything. Daniel joined us shortly after, his presence filling the space in a way that felt slightly delayed, as if he had entered a conversation already in progress without knowing exactly where he stood in it. He glanced at the folder, then at Sophia, then briefly at me, and in that sequence, everything became clearer. This was not just her plan. He was part of it, whether actively or passively did not matter anymore. What mattered was that he had chosen not to question it. I took a slow sip of my tea, setting the cup down with steady hands, and for the first time since this had begun, I felt something settle completely into place. Not anger, not disappointment, just certainty, because now there were no more missing pieces. And when you have the full picture, you no longer need to guess what comes next. You decide. That afternoon, I made a call I had not needed to make in years, not because I had forgotten the number, but because I had never imagined a reason to use it again. And when the familiar voice answered on the other end, steady and professional, I introduced myself calmly, giving my full name, letting the silence settle just long enough for recognition to return. He remembered me. Of course he did. Some relationships are built on moments that leave a mark, and my late husband had trusted him with matters that required both discretion and precision. I asked if he had time to review something with me, my tone even, my request simple, and when he agreed without hesitation, I felt that same quiet certainty settle deeper, not as relief, but as confirmation that I was moving in the right direction. The drive to his office took just under 20 minutes, passing through parts of town that had not changed much over the years, but I noticed everything differently now. The way people moved, the way routines played out, all of it steady, predictable, untouched by the kind of shift I had just stepped into. His office was exactly as I remembered, clean lines, neutral colors, a space designed to keep emotion out of the conversation, and that suited me perfectly. I placed the folder on his desk without explanation at first, letting him open it, letting him read, watching not just the documents, but his reaction to them, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the pause before he turned a page, the way his posture adjusted as he began to understand what he was looking at. When he finally looked up, he did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply confirmed what I already knew, that these documents were not finalized, that they required my approval, my signature, my agreement, none of which had been given. That was the key. Everything else, the planning, the positioning, the quiet conversations behind closed doors, all of it depended on something they did not yet have. My consent. I nodded once, absorbing the confirmation without visible reaction, and asked what options remained available to me, not out of uncertainty, but out of intention. He outlined them clearly, methodically, each step grounded in structure, in law, in facts that could not be adjusted by interpretation or persuasion. As he spoke, I realized something important, something that shifted the entire balance in a way Sophia could not have anticipated. Control is not about who speaks the most or who moves first. It is about who understands the foundation everything else is built on. And in this case, that foundation had not moved at all. When I left the office, the air outside felt sharper, cleaner, as if the weight that had been pressing quietly in the background had lifted just enough to reveal a clearer path forward. I did not rush back home. There was no urgency anymore. I stopped briefly at a small cafe, ordered a cup of coffee, and sat by the window, watching the world move at its usual pace, people unaware, conversations unfolding without hidden meaning, or at least without the kind I was now trained to notice. I took my time, letting the realization settle fully, not just in thought, but in understanding. They had been preparing for something they believed was inevitable. They had been positioning themselves as if the outcome was already decided. But they had overlooked one detail. The outcome had never been theirs to decide. When I finally returned home, the house greeted me with the same quiet stillness, but this time, it did not feel uncertain. It felt defined. I placed my keys down, moved through the hallway with steady steps, and as I reached the living room, I saw Sophia sitting exactly where I expected her to be, her posture composed, her attention focused, but her awareness shifting the moment I entered. She looked up, meeting my gaze, searching for something, perhaps a reaction, perhaps confirmation that her plan was still intact. I gave her a small, calm smile, nothing more, nothing less, and in that moment, I knew something she did not. The balance had already shifted. She just had not realized it yet. That night, I set the table the same way I always had, placing each plate with care, aligning the silverware, smoothing the edges of the napkins. As if routine itself could hold everything steady. But this time it was not about preserving what used to be, it was about preparing for what was about to unfold. Daniel came in first, loosening his tie as he took his usual seat, his movements automatic, his attention divided, and Sophia followed shortly after, composed as ever, her presence filling the room in that quiet, controlled way she had perfected over time. I did not rush. I poured water into each glass, took my seat, and allowed the silence to settle naturally before speaking. I told them I had reviewed the documents from the morning, my voice calm, steady, leaving no room for misinterpretation, and I watched closely as that single sentence shifted the air between us. Daniel looked up immediately, his expression tightening in a way he could not quite hide, while Sophia remained still for just a fraction of a second longer than usual before offering a small, measured smile. She began to speak, to explain again, to guide the conversation back into the version she had prepared, but this time I did not let her lead it. I raised my hand slightly, not abruptly, just enough to pause her, and continued speaking without raising my voice. I told them that nothing in that folder could move forward without my direct approval, that every line, every transfer, every intention written on those pages required something they did not yet have, and I let that truth sit between us without softening it. Daniel shifted in his seat, his discomfort visible now, his silence no longer neutral but heavy, while Sophia's composure adjusted, not breaking, but tightening, like someone recalculating in real time. She asked, carefully, what I intended to do, her tone still controlled, but the question itself revealing more than she realized. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I took a slow sip of water, setting the glass down with the same steady motion I had used all evening, and when I finally spoke, I told them that intention is only meaningful when it is built on honesty, and that I had spent the past few days listening very carefully. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from before, no longer controlled, no longer curated, but exposed. I continued, not accusing, not raising my voice, simply stating what had already become clear to me, that plans had been made without me, that conversations had taken place behind closed doors, and that assumptions had been formed about what I would accept without ever asking me directly. Daniel looked down at the table, his hands still, his usual confidence absent, while Sophia held my gaze, her expression composed but no longer as certain as it had been. I did not need to say everything. I did not need to reveal every detail I had uncovered. The truth, when placed correctly, does not need to be explained. It speaks for itself. I told them that I would be making my own arrangements moving forward, that I would review everything independently, and that nothing would proceed unless it aligned with what I decided was right. There was no anger in my voice, no hesitation, just clarity. For the first time since this began, I was not responding to what they had set in motion. I was defining what would happen next. Sophia did not interrupt. She did not argue. She simply nodded once, slowly, her mind already shifting, adjusting to a reality she had not planned for. Daniel remained quiet, his silence now carrying weight instead of avoidance. I stood up before either of them could respond further, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with purpose, and I gathered my plate, moving toward the kitchen with the same calm I had carried all evening. Behind me, the room stayed silent. I did not need to look back to know that something had changed in a way that could not be undone. Because control had never been about speaking first or planning ahead. It had always been about understanding when to step in. And now I had. In this gripping story of hidden intentions and quiet power, an elderly mother begins to notice subtle changes within her own home as her daughter-in-law carefully reshapes the family dynamic with calculated precision. What begins as an ordinary dinner slowly unfolds into a deeply layered emotional journey filled with tension, observation, and silent confrontation, making it one of the most compelling family stories that explores trust, control, and betrayal without raising a single voice. Through careful pacing and psychological depth, this narrative reveals how a mother, once at the center of her family, is gradually pushed to the margins by a daughter-in-law who operates with quiet confidence and strategic intent, turning everyday interactions into moments loaded with meaning. As the elderly mother pieces together the truth behind documents, conversations, and carefully staged behavior, viewers are drawn into a world where nothing is accidental and every detail matters, elevating this into one of the most thought-provoking family stories that highlights the emotional resilience of women who refuse to be underestimated. The tension builds not through confrontation, but through silence. As the daughter-in-law attempts to guide outcomes behind the scenes while the mother calmly regains control by understanding the legal and emotional foundation beneath it all, creating a powerful contrast that defines the core of this story. This is not just a tale of conflict, but a masterclass in quiet strength, where the elderly mother transforms from observer to decision-maker, shifting the balance of power without dramatic outbursts, making it stand out among modern family stories that focus on intelligence over impulse. As the narrative unfolds, the audience witnesses how perception, patience, and timing become the true tools of control, offering a deeper perspective on how family relationships can be influenced by unspoken agendas and hidden motives. The daughter-in-law believes she has planned every outcome, yet the elderly mother reveals that true authority lies not in manipulation, but in understanding when to act, reinforcing why this belongs among the most engaging family stories that resonate with viewers who appreciate subtle drama and emotional depth. By the end, the story delivers a powerful message about dignity, awareness, and self-respect, showing that even in the most controlled situations, truth has a way of surfacing, securing its place as one of the most memorable family stories that captures the complexity of human relationships and the quiet strength of those who choose not to be defeated.